Hello, gentle readers. It's October 7th, 2025. October, the month that ends with All Hallows Eve or Halloween every year. October, the air has taken a nice cooler chill in the evenings, resulting that it's about 35 degrees outside in the morning. And I've adopted back some of the usual layers. One of my dusty FBI style jackets and the Wild West looking U.S. Marshal bit, and a bit of Champion track wear. You can't run a 4-minute mile without running a 1-minute quarter mile is the usual idea. That today I thought I'd like to, in Logos 2000, gentle readers, fellow Earthlings, get to Quine and DesCartes a bit, as in the course of Logos 2000, that is what's been being arrived at as a philosophical treatise has kind of already happened in the middle with the Foundations Briefly account. And so Foundations Briefly, according to me and AI, is a great thing. And then when it gets to what we might consider along the lines of the denouement and to the resolution of a philosophical treatise, is that for something like Moment in Motion, it started with a theory of waves and then got to a resolution, or it ended with World's Turn, helping to establish the overall discourse in the milieu of the classical as a matter of the precision of the perspective and projection, yet as well only that being an ephemeral thing in the sum of potentials. So World's Turn is the key takeaway from that and all its mathematical machinery. Then this Logos 2000, with regards to 21st century discourse, it starts with the idea of the 20th century, and then getting and some controversy, it may be said, in the 20th century. Then with regards to the circulus, logicus, virtus, and then ex falso nihilum, helping to prevent problems in logic from resulting a smoking robot does not compute, that it does compute, and that logic can never break anything except other logic. But with regards to reasoners, that it's possible, if in an ideal sense, to keep reason, de res, de ratio, de natura, de re, the reason, the rationality, the nature, and the real. So today what I hope to do is get into a bit of Quine and DesCartes, René Descartes. I like to think of Descartes as kind of a comrade of sorts, but to use that term more of in the French sense, a brother or a cousin of sorts. Because at least somewhere 400 or 500 years ago, we're from the same place. So Renatus Descartes is also considered a cousin of sorts ideologically and in these endeavors and these kinds of things. So in the last few episodes, what's been going on is recounting the diving, the digging through a box of these books. So now I put away or got through that box of books and packed the box of books back full of books, and another one too. And so I'll return those to the archive, the repository, and get a couple other boxes of books carrying forward. But of course, I'm just surrounded by stacks of these books because over the years, I have made an effort to always be looking for and acquiring these tomes, these what are considered, if passé, in a sense, yet enduring and durable, these books, that I have enough by now to make a pretty good university library for these purposes of science and up to including physics and mathematics and logic, all in one place. And then with regards to figuring out how to say, well, when somebody has got some books or physical media like DVDs or CDs or DVDs, then is it possible to set up a system like a lending library, which basically makes it possible that according to the possession of a physical copy, one can loan the right to read it over a digital medium, is that there are some examples and precedents about that, and where it's generally considered that it would demand controls. It's called digital rights management, and for the intellectual property is what it is. And not all these works by any means are out of print or out of copyright, although most of them are out of print. Yet most are in copyright. Yet the ones from the more than 70 years ago or so are in public domain, one might say. That then trying to figure out for this sort of library and these things is it's just a matter of being able to consult that in the reverie, having a bit of a little library and a sort of an observatory of these kinds of things, being considered in the old-fashioned passé sort of way, rather gentlemanly, say, and as of an educated person. So these I hold in very high regards, because as if perhaps a pseudo intellectual, it's something that I find that much more fun than using my shovel to dig things, or various tools of any sort, or these kinds of things. Well, still that, of course, life must go on, and work must go on, and shoveling is good exercise. So today, I'll just kind of recount what I've kept out of that box of books, and it will later go in another box of books, but just give an idea of something that I was just going to reflect on a little bit further. And then I have a box of fiction here, and I'm going to talk about that a minute. And then there's something along the lines of Quine and Descartes. So this is the story of Euler's number. The second part of the calculus is integral calculus. Now, you can have the integral calculus be the first instead of the differential calculus. And here again, Leibniz's notation proves superior to Newton's. So when you think about the Newtons and the fluents and fluxions, which really make for going the other way than the usual account of the derivative, finding the tangent of a curve according to an analytic formula for the equation or formula of a curve, then there's that Newton's notation can be seen as talking about a quite altogether different thing than Leibniz's notation. Leibniz. That Leibniz's notation is considered with regards to the raw differential and then the sum, the integral sum. That the integral S bar is for the sum. And the D for the differential is also for the difference, but really for the differential. And then that it is well so that the partial differential is yet another takeaway from that. So with regards to Newton and Leibniz, and they're given priority as both having discovered the calculus, and here mathematics is discovered, not invented, though we invent words to describe it. And that those are then discoveries with regards to the Entbergung and these kinds of accounts of after the Alethetic and the ancient accounts, where it is given that mathematics is discovered, not invented, because it's true. That then what we get to here with regards to Leibniz and Newton is that they are both described as inventors or discoverers of the calculus, meaning the integral calculus or differential calculus, because there's all kinds of calculi. It's anything that calculates. But for these, as well, they can be seen as kind of separate methods, and so they can be taken apart and put back together in different sorts of ways. And they both have a little bit more of their appropriate milieus. So to say that Leibniz is superior to Newton is perhaps so, as that's what everybody uses, and that's their best intuition of things. Yet it is well so that one may ascribe certain particular accounts to a certain linear interpretation of Newton, which would carry less baggage or carry more weight, those kinds of things. Oh, and then it's getting into a spiral. And this is something that was mentioned before. It happened to be the same page. The author Mary quotes Benjamin Peirce, one of Harvard's leading mathematicians in the 19th century. Euler's formula came as something of a revelation. And so Peirce said, "Gentlemen, that is surely true. It is absolutely paradoxical. We cannot understand it. We don't know what it means, but we have proved it, and therefore we know it must be the truth." So, with regards to Euler's identity, here it's framed in terms of it's after de Moivre's formulas in the trigonometric, and then combining that with the complex analysis, and I do well to remember, but I don't have the sort of eidetic or photographic or instant recall memory to recall exactly who kind of came up with complex numbers and how they arrived to Euler, who spent a lot of time working on complex analysis vis-a-vis infinite series, and to be able to arrive at something like the sum of the integers is -1/12 or something like that, as having to be deconstructed to make any sort of sense at all. The de Moivre and then Euler and then the Gaussian have for that pretty much the entire account of why complex analysis is everywhere is that there's various ways to deconstruct that, and you can read or listen more about these here. And it's to be said though that there are kind of models of integers or particular concerns and derivations that break Euler's identity. I mentioned logos. Indeed, the Greek word for rational is logos, from which the modern word logic derives. So, as discussed here, the word logos is quite a few things. It's a discourse and on reason, and for the rational. The density, Pythagoras. Here, the other day, I encouraged the AI to help explain the Pythagorean, where everything almost or pretty much is rational, and the Cantorian, where everything almost is transcendental. They're opposite. They're kind of opposite each other. And modern mathematics sort of has an account that it's one way, and classical mathematics has the account that it's the other. And then putting them together is where a lot of these accounts are necessary to make it so that otherwise either breaks the other, and they're not consistent together. And then by simply thinking about it, they're not consistent apart. And so then putting them back together is after this deconstructive account, like here. And so it's attributed that the rationals are not continuous was attributed to Pythagoras. And that is axiomatized, that the ordered field becomes a complete ordered field, is usually left out of accounts and kind of glossed over. It's just said, well, these do exist here like so, and then it would have to have this property, so obviously it does. And it's like, well, if you say so, But here, that's line rails gives a continuous domain first, and then it's possible to say that this other continuous domain, as it would be, sits on a continuous domain, and so that thusly least upper bound and measure 1.0 are made. Selected papers on physical processes in ionized plasmas. Theory of hydrogenic spectra. Physical processes in gaseous nebula. Interpretation of nebular spectra. Intensities of forbidden spectral lines. So the ultraviolet catastrophe came as after blackbody radiation in the entire era of when old quantum mechanics went towards making new quantum mechanics where everything is quantized and finite. And then for the ultraviolet catastrophe after Rayleigh and Rayleigh-Jeans, then the spectral analysis gave so much great and wonderful results here with regards to the ultraviolet catastrophe, where catastrophe, most people would hear that and think a disaster, but what it means in mathematics is an opening in multiplicity theory of what's otherwise a singularity or asymptote in singularity theory. So besides what we usually think are the principal branches of things, which might just be the envelopes of things, and these are words from mathematics where principal branch means when there's a multiplicity, then to pick one, and an envelope means when there's a system like as of an integral equation, when at the end it's undefined or it's an indefinite quantity, that it's just that's what it is, its origin and it's singular and these kinds of things. That reflecting on that is also then to get into that when our entire classical milieu, which is like vector addition and the usual idea of an XY plane or Cartesian the way of things, which is so great, is that's just kind of a dot. And so what really entails is that the outside is what makes that so. Instead of it being built and augmented and incremented to make the outside, that it is the outside that focuses into it. So this book is for physics and plasma physics, 1937. 1938. Copyright 1962. Dover Publications. Reprinted all this wonderfully after it, I imagine, came into the public domain or what. The mechanistic and equilibrium treatment of nebular statistics. Electron temperatures. See, these are conflating different sorts of milieus because it's like, well, we got to describe one in terms of the other, and either one is outside the theory of the other one. So let's put them together, and then we'll just kind of relax both of them. Composition of the planetary nebula. Spectrum of NGC 7027, spectrophotometry of planetary nebulae. So this is largely a combination of the cosmological and the atomic or submicroscopic. The intensities of forbidden spectral lines. The computation of the quadrupole and magnetic dipole transition probabilities. In the introduction, the author says, hydrogen is the atom. Spectroscopic analysis reveals that about 90% of all the atoms are hydrogen. Some 9% are helium. The remaining 1% comprises all the remaining chemical elements. We often tend to forget that the principal series of hydrogen lines lies in the far ultraviolet, with Lyman alpha occurring at 1215 angstroms and the long wave limit of the continuum falling at 912 angstroms. So this helps to express that for like the Lyman and Balmer series and the following series, the ones higher than the second being kind of in the realm of the finite and discrete, the spectra, is underneath in the Lyman spectra is like this, as the author puts it, the continuum, the limit of the continuum. Thus, in this shortwave region, for all classes of stars, hot or cold, hydrogen atoms exert a controlling influence upon the opacity of the gas. So this is with regards to the hydrogen line, standard candles, and the usual account is after somebody like that explains the hydrogen lines, or who wrote this, We Are Not Alone, this fellow, and I'll remember this name. It's right on the tip of my tongue. It's right somewhere in the midst of my forebrain. That Sullivan. That this is a good example of helping explain what all this stuff is and how it's supposed to be. Recognizing the importance of hydrogen astrophysics. So this then gets into a lot of things from all these astrophysicists and quantum physicists. Before we can attack the problem of radiation transfer for the lines, we must solve it for the Lyman continuum. In the next paper of the series, we shall discuss the transfer of radiation in the Lyman continuum. So I kept this out because I thought that would be kind of profound, because these are the kinds of things that need to be revisited because they're missing. And to put them back, we already have ones to look at. Ecce Homo from Friedrich Nietzsche, The Hard Sayings of Jesus. So let's find a bit. So when you say something's hard, like a hard saying of Jesus, it's like, well, do you mean it's hard as in it's a hard and fast, meaning fixed condition that Jesus says this as one of the teachings of, in this case, the Christian tradition? Or is it hard as in it's like it's hard to accept, it's hard to digest, it's difficult from our human condition? And he talks about being humble, and he talks about authority. And he talks about, he says, in Mark 8:34, he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So he says that's usually is like, don't second guess somebody until you've walked a mile in their shoes. Kind of being as regards to that kind of thing. The author Bruce expresses some ideas of what would be considered, in or out kind of a thing, kind of like when you have a dog and it constantly wants out, and so you let it out, and then it constantly wants in, you let it in, in or out is kind of the idea. And he talks about the difference between man and why man is a higher animal or not an animal. Ooh. He says Matthew 23:33. There the eagles will be gathered together. I'm not sure what this is to mean. First, the Hebrew word normally translated eagle in the Old Testament appears occasionally to denote the vulture, which is a carrion feeder. And eagles, sometimes like a bald eagle, will fly up and down the river out here because they live up the river or down the river. But they're also like the turkey vultures, which are condors, larger birds. There are many species in, for example, North America that are not really considered among the usual accounts, and that's too bad because of the great extinctions and all that. But there are and not cryptozoological creatures, but stuff like like giant pheasants or funnel spiders or like turtles that live through the winter and these kinds of things that are simply not part of the usual counts. And so according to things like the Endangered Species Acts, they would be protected, but they're just not even talked about, kind of. But the bald eagle is highly protected, and I found a feather the other day, and it's mine now. So about the eagles, what he says is, it just says that when you see a bunch of vultures, that there's usually, it's like when there's smoke, there's fire, or something like that. He says, well, if you want a sword, buy one. The usual idea of Jesus in his presentation is as of his suffering for man on the cross, and thus knowing the story of how he transcends the flesh. But then otherwise, Jesus is often given on a crown with a book and a sword, and helping to effect to reflect that his authority, his knowledge, and his power. And vis-a-vis his humility, in a sense, those are usual sorts of associations with regards to that as from the anthropocentric theory of man, and for example, as Friedrich Nietzsche would account for of an anthropocentric theory of man. Vis-a-vis the anthropomorphization of things, that those are things are ascribed to the authority, thusly. And so, as we read Nietzsche the other day, what we found was that he found his eternal text, and he did become a Platonist again. And he talks about his suffering and the beauty. He said it was the beauty of it all that turned him back to happiness, in a sense. These three decisive overtures on the part of a psychologist to a transvaluation of all values. This book contains the first psychology of the priests. So about Zarathustra, Nietzsche basically puts himself up as an interpreter of this greater word. Vis-a-vis ordination and these kinds of things. If you should require a formula for a destiny of this kind that has taken human form, you will find it in my Zarathustra. And I enjoy Zarathustra. It's supposed to be fiction. It reminds me so much of Siddhartha and Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. So yeah, like in the Nietzsche Register is a book I have, and it has all these different works of Nietzsche, and then all the mentions of him. And so that's kind of a good thing to have. But then for reading Nietzsche, one should, if they're of a philosophical mindset and want to know kind of what all the other people influenced by philosophy are philosophers would be, then Nietzsche is a bit of required reading. And it's pretty heavy, but it can be picked up and put down. And it can be read for just enjoyment in the sense, usually, or to suffer along with Nietzsche, which most people would not choose. Then I kept up this theory of heat. This Becker's theory of heat is considered great. I mean, it gets into the whole thing with regards to the modern way, and it is today too. Then this wasn't mentioned in Walking Past, so I don't want to mention it. In a series in affective science, what the face reveals. Basic and applied studies of spontaneous expression using the facial action coding system, FACS. So this intends to describe for things like image recognition and facial recognition, what tics or muscle movements, either of the voluntary, involuntary, or conscious or subconscious of the face. For example, like in the Indian dance, where the movements of the face and the eye movements, kind of like the apsara, are all particularly defined as refined to be conscious and exact and voluntary, but also prescribed. That then this gets into what it means to try to read somebody's face like an open book, as if it were written on their face. The study of spontaneous facial expressions in psychology. So the spontaneous then would usually be as of the involuntary, vis-a-vis any sort of, putting a face on and these kinds of things. The masks and these things. Oxford University Press, 2005. What the face reveals is strong evidence for the fruitfulness of the systematic analysis of facial expression initiated by Paul Ekman and Wallace V. Friesen in 1976 and 1978, also become a valuable, even obligatory resource for all investigators who wish to use or understand the facial action coding system, FACS, as Ekman and Friesen's approach is called. So they basically made a formalism, and here that's related to the pain scale. From 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? And these kinds of things, as that being gross, and at the same time that there may be things to represent that are commonalities among people, but some people smile at things that other people frown at, and vice versa. And some people's frowns look like smiles, and some people's smiles look like frowns. Then he gets an image processing and analysis with regards to experiments. Mostly with regards to the eyes, the brow, the lips, and the corners of the mouth. And a bit the nose. Mostly the brows and a bit the mouth. Of facial action coding system. Vis-a-vis something like MPEG-4 and synthetic natural hybrid coding, which is when they made MPEG-2 video, and then they made MPEG-4 video, and then they made SNHC, and the idea is that, that's when you can put together all kinds of display elements and as well live action motion picture, and then also as with regards to 3D representations of anything and rendering and these kinds of things. So synthetic natural hybrid coding is basically all kinds of ideas of what you might be able to get from imaging and on a 2D or two-dimensional, usually the idea is display. We're here, for example, from the color and light theory, that's going to vary a bit because eyeballs are spherical. Here's this Forster and Stedman on thinking and writing to reasons why we're out of the mud and this kind of stuff. Oh, the fiction. Before we get to Descartes then and Quine, here's the fiction. So this random sampling, here's a bit of Shakespeare, Hamlet and King Lear, and The Merchant of Venice. I really like The Tempest. And in the modern days, one of the things that came up about 10 or 15 years ago is they started having students read both The Tempest, which is brief, and watch The Forbidden Planet or something like that, and then help compare them as with regards to those being with regards to like the syntheses and the powers of things, magic and logic together. So that's one of those things. A book by L. Ron Hubbard. This is part of L. Ron Hubbard's series it's a science fiction series about aliens invade the Earth and humanity crashes, and yet there's still, the humanity is a man still suffering from the predations of these aliens, finds a way to find the legacy of the science and the technology and survives. And then using his intelligence and strength and dare, he is able to destroy the enemy and overturn their tyranny, and that's the end. So there's about 10 volumes like this. It's about 10 volumes of this. This one's called this Mission Earth or whatever it is. And so that's not to be related necessarily with later. Then it was like they made all that Scientology and all that kind of stuff. So there's a big, huge difference between something like Christian Science and the Christian Science Reading Room and Scientology and the Enneagrams and this kind of stuff like that. While at the same time they kind of have some scientific aspects associated with them, with regards to the idea like the jart. And now, what's a jart? You might ask yourself. Well, think of a bad dream, say, abstractly, if not to descend into nightmares. But a jart is basically the idea. It's kind of like a virus, but it's purely mental. And so the jart is a very, very dangerous thing. I mean, is it worse than something like the soul vampire or some of these other ideas of basically what do I call it, enmities of sort explained often in fiction, because it's the pseudo-scientific or unscientific to try and describe them to usual matters of fact. They're still like so. A mental virus, say, vis-a-vis viruses that affect the brain, like SARS-CoV-2 or something like that eventually. So jarts are bad. This is from Gene Auel, so Auell. So the Earth's Children series is set in the time of hominids when Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens lived together, and the story of a person, Ayla, who's strong and suffers in life as she's orphaned, and then taken in by a different society, and then thrown out and rejected from this other society, and then makes herself as an individual, and then gets to another society, and then reaches a really pretty great place, and with all the ideas of the culture and the religion they had. So this was in the 80s or so. This was a bestseller. This was a bestseller, meaning most people still had books in their houses, and everybody had heard of this who read books. And it would be considered that when we read these when we were children or youth, and not only because they had scenes of graphic depictions, and they're the only means available to find such depictions of things so graphically was textually. So that this is just an example among fiction that was, I've read all these before. The Valley of the Horses, that was kind of the way to get started on that. Time Machine 2. So when you think of Time Machine, and it's Wells, H.G. Wells. So I just found this the other day, and this is called Time Machine 2, a sequel to the H.G. Wells classic by George Powell and Joe Morhaime. And so I don't know how they can really say that this book from Dell Science Fiction is a sequel to Time Machine, and because Time Machine didn't really have much going on in it. I mean, he basically got lost in a subterranean tower and just kept climbing back up and down and finally got out. But then this is supposedly about that as well. There's also stuff like, the War of the Worlds and stuff from H.G. Wells, who is kind of like, he reminds me of the director of 2001 and these kinds of things. A Wrinkle in Time, Madeline Engle's Wrinkle in Time. So this has got 3 to 5 books in it, and we read this when we were children, and it's about a family, and the protagonist is a youth, and the illness and the fatal terminal illness of one of her parents. And it ended up being that it was framed in terms of it was a mitochondrial disease. And so she travels through space and time to save her mother. These are great books. These are great. bio of a space tyrant, Piers Anthony. So Piers Anthony wrote a bunch of great stuff, including about the logic of the magic. And this is science fiction. It's nice and hard. And what it has in it is it's an economy based on contraterrene or antimatter iron used as a fuel source to explain how Earth became a solar space system faring species and colonizes and occupies all the worlds and in the solar system. And then there is like also matching the political things today. So today, from somebody like Piers and Anthony, what I'm reading is something about like Cuba, and he has a co-author, but it's kind of in his style. And so I'm about through with that book about time travel in Cuba. These being fictional accounts of things, but I definitely read all these books from Piers and Anthony I could find, which are like 30 or 40 of them when I was a kid. Shakespeare and Macbeth. Here's another Piers Anthony. This is from the Curlian or Clusters trilogy. Let's see what's going on in here. Oh, this is where the communication is ongoing between the aliens. And so on. So that's just to go through just some few cultural references with regards to things like, you know, Stephen King and those are very widely read. For something like Eyes of the Dragon or something like that. Or Talisman is a great book, and it's got a happy ending. Like most of those addled, troubling fantasies, as they may be. That thusly we're about to get into Descartes and Quine a little bit. Quine's word and object is after the whole endeavor of logicist positivism, and basically he's finding where its edges and kind of suggesting how things are okay underneath that. Here's a word that's hard to remember what it is. Syncategorematic. 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 Take the use of true rather as syncategorematic, and you construe true love as referring merely to that which is truly love, or perhaps to him or her who is truly loved. So talk about true and false. And here, this is like earlier was represented as the poor judge of character. Is it? You know, the use of true and false in true artist and false prophet is syncategorematic, for a false prophet is no prophet, and a true artist, though truly an artist, is not an artist who is true. On the other hand, true and false statements are sentences that are true and false. Here, the use of the adjectives is truly attributive in sense. The term true love is ambiguous on the point. Take the use of true here as truly attributive in sense, and you construe true love as referring to steadfast love, or perhaps to a steadfast or steadfastly loved one. Take the use of true rather as syncategorematic, and you construe true love as referring merely to that which is truly love, or perhaps to him or who is truly loved. So these are strong terms and they're influential. And with regards to the syncategorematic, and then we have things like with regards to self-association, self-reference, and the, what do they call that? Something to do with a sentence that describes itself or doesn't describe itself, and these kinds of things. With regards to Nihil and the context and surrounds, talks about Gershwin, Plato, and Lewis Carroll, or Charles Lutwidge Dodson, I suppose you might say. What is troublesome about the indefinite singular term nothing is its tendency to masquerade as a definite. So nothing and nobody is one of those ways, kind of like double negatives, to consider something evaluated and that it just falls out, meaning it's incompleted and in fact says nothing. And so when you think about nobody and nowhere man in his nowhere land for nobody, you know, that's kind of like my name is nobody or somebody like that. Yeah, it is so, as Quine points out, that nothing or nobody is an indefinite singular term. And then as regards to when it is outside that in the context, here is that we still have our apple in the context and everything else that is not is it again. So that's just the usual idea. But there's some things I marked here, so let's see if I marked some of these pages, what particularly to quote from Quine. so-called mass terms. So this would be about the group nouns like set or class, and then set class distinction when they can't be a class distinction. When you say there's like a herd or a barrel or any kind of ideas of group nouns, you eventually run out of group nouns when trying to make distinctions. And so that gets into all the ideas of like whether a null or a nothing is unique or for each type distinct. And so there's ways to look at it either way. And one way keeps things real simple, and the other way keeps things real thorough. And so they both have their definite requirements when it's so necessary to be unambiguous and definite. So yeah, that would be as for group nouns or mass terms. Also about the mass terms in the plural. This was like, is motion, is it ever not plural? So-called mass terms like water, footwear, and red have the semantical property of referring cumulatively. Any sum of parts which are water is water. Then this also gets into this kind of thing. Oh, and then maybe this footnote was what was so referenced. A term with this semantic trait is what Goodman, Structure of Appearance, page 49, calls collective. I should indeed prefer collective term to mass term for words like water and the like. So that's just the difference kind of between the continuous and the discrete. For words like water and the like, were it not too apt to suggest such unintended cases as flock, army, etc. Partitive is inviting, but it connotes a wrong principle, since some parts of furniture and even of water are not furniture or water. Strawson's term, in particular and general, is material name. So here we point kind of to Strawson as, saying and pointing out when some of these things are it would be duplicitous or a lie to say they were so. That Strawson helps to amend or repair, or at least address that these things are not wrong. And then there's, it reminds me of Chwistek and Chwistek and Sheffer, as Russell relates, are more the proper modal relativists that are better than those that are the quasi-modal relativists. Where we can all be modal relativists. And indeed, each is. Opportunistic departure from ordinary language. He talks about ordinary language and ambiguities of scope. Here that was discussed with regards to, for example, disambiguation of the universal quantifier and such. Some departures from ordinary linguistic behavior, if the need that prompts them persists, may be adhered to, thus becoming ordinary language in the narrow sense. And herein lies one factor in the evolution of language. Others are reserved for use as needed. So Quine is helping to explore that language embodies all the vagaries and indefinites and ambiguities that otherwise undeclared or unstated assumptions may so entail. And the ordinary use of the language is supposed to be unsurprising, but what's unsurprising to given people would be surprising to other given people or under different circumstances. So when Quine wants to be able to say is like, well, we got a theory and it fits on our computer and it's got everything in it and it's ordinary and that's the end. Here's addressing that is like, well, when it's not, then what are we going to do about it? And then also that if we have one and we want to make our own little language, then how can we keep that so it can't be misinterpreted or wrongly interpreted? The artificial notation of logic is itself explained, of course, in ordinary language. So when Quine says, of course, sometimes he means, of course, because obviously it's clear that it will always be so. And sometimes he says, of course, because he means, because of course I got to say this, or otherwise I would be wrong. And in a point he's trying to defend, otherwise the of course. So of course here has in the inductive account we kind of have to reread Quine and read him backward and forward to take from his account what otherwise would end up not saying much at all. And so these 15 or 20 lectures from Quine's highest point in his mental development, maturity in his career, have it like so that that's why when we look at Quine, we consider him as helping to keep the dialogue open for the 20th century. And then he points to like Goodman and Strawson and some of these other thinkers for like these lines to where then we'd be able to say, well, at least somebody back then hadn't falsely closed the door and made a false bottom of their foundations. If we were to devise the logic of ordinary language for direct use on sentences as they come, we would have to complicate our rules of inference in sundry unilluminating ways. So this is like the exception in the rule in this kind of bit. But also it's like, well, the problem is it wasn't done underneath in the front where they would always just be like, well, instead of making it so that when something's wrong, it explodes catastrophically and nothing can be done about it, and it's an error mode that's fatal, then it's like, well, we'll just do everything twice on the way up, so that way there's redundancy and resiliency and the idea to turn these things over instead of the entire enterprise being destroyed. Now, that's rather strong. But the idea is to intend to detail that otherwise this given out is like, well, you know, the risk is minimal, but the damage is entire. Here in another footnote, Quine often will put in his footnotes these great leads, Lucasiewicz, and so Lucasiewicz is given for the idea of true, false, and then if we don't know, or otherwise it's not true and it's not false, we say something else. So Lucasiewicz has pointed out that the benefits of parentheses can be gained without their aid by adopting a prepositive symbol for each basic construction in the sense of 11 and fixing for each such construction the number of terms or sentences that it is to admit as immediate components. So this is great because kind of like what I just said about the idea of having always this boilerplate that it kind of makes it so that it's like, yes, given things are holding up, they're still holding up. Vis-a-vis is like forward no matter what. That this is the idea that Lucasiewicz notices that this is like, well, it's just a matter of resources, and so you can kind of build that forward. And then for parentheses and quoting and matters of language, for the polyglot parser and parsing the language is all these things to do that are not so many of things like quoting and bracketing and quoting, and whether language starts in a quoting context or contains boundaries in quoting contexts. The wider context. Use, mention, distinction, quoting, brackets and boundaries, the depth of the abstract syntax tree, the abstract syntax sequence, the abstract syntax context. Quine. Again, we would have to incorporate rules on agreement of tense so as to disallow inference, for example, of the atemporal, reflecting kind of like for Goodman's the blue-green, blue-green, bleen or grew, with regards to when two things came together that were separated, instead of like two things came together that are separated, because temporarily they don't match. By developing our logical theory strictly for sentences in a convenient canonical form, we achieve the best division of labor. On the one hand, there is theoretical deduction. On the other hand, there is the work of paraphrasing ordinary language into the theory. The latter job is the less tidy of the two, but still it will usually present little difficulty to one familiar with the canonical notation. For normally he himself is the one who has uttered, as part of some present job, the sentence of ordinary language concerned, and he can then judge outright whether his ends are served by the paraphrase. So this goes into showing that Quine is sort of speaking to people who have to utter perfectly precise language that can be read no other way, yet still is according to goals that aren't implicit, or rather explicit in the conversation. So here there's not that burden, that onus, and it's not considered a luxury to have then this wider full of dialectic otherwise, because Aristotle won't be made a fool, and we like it that way. The artificial notation of logic is itself explained, of course, in ordinary language. Yeah, eventually it must be. It's called intersubjectivity. Okay, with time going like so, we want to save some time for Descartes. Spelling, however protracted. So then we get into words and their etymology and the parts of speech and the parts of words. Flight from intention, intentionality and extensionality. Everything and something. The footnote says, mistaken critical remarks keep one reminded that there are those who fancy the mathematical phrase values of the variables to mean singular terms substitutable for the variables. It is rather the object designated by such a term that counts as a value of the variable, and objects stand as values of the variable through this, though the singular terms be swept away. That they're not, you know. This is the fill in the blanks and the connect the dots bit. He talks about his plan. We do have our analyticity intuition, but it grades off. So he's talking about diminishing returns and this kinds of things. Mates, Church, and Scheffler have argued that Carnap's intentional isomorphism and Lewis's earlier construction of similar character is still too broad for interchange in context of propositional attitude. Putnam and Church have responded with proposals for further tightening the relation. I really don't get much out of Hilary Putnam. That guy is, I think, is a sophist and on purpose. And I never have needed anything from what he said. Although I do like at least one some of these Lewis's. See Chisholm, Perceiving, chapter 11, and his references to Brentano. On the austere scheme which Bergmann, intentionality, calls Elsie, see further. Its more liberal variant, accommodating intentional idioms, answers in spirit, though not in detail, to Bergmann's. Bergmann is nearer Brentano than Quine, but it is a difference not easily assessed, for we are agreed both that the intentional does not reduce, and is at least in a practical way indispensable. For a closer analysis of the distinction, see Stanley. So Quine helps a lot to establish other thinkers who will stand up what he says, even when he can't really say it. Such reflections partake of what churchmen called higher criticism. They are directed at reconciling some limitedly useful lesser theory with a more sweeping theory which on a literal-minded reading it contradicts. The infinitesimal calculus with the classical mechanics of number, the mechanics of ideal objects with general physics, and Newton's physics with Einstein's. But meanwhile, let us keep in mind also that knowledge normally develops in a multiplicity of theories, each with its limited utility in each, unless it harbors more danger than utility with its internal consistency. These theories overlap very considerably in their so-called logical laws and in much else, but that they add up to an integrated and consistent whole is only a worthy ideal, and happily not a prerequisite of scientific progress. Yet here it sort of eventually is, because science needs mathematics of continuity and infinity, which have to have their ideals. The continuing utility of the mechanics of ideal objects and Newtonian mechanics is ample reason for treasuring and teaching these theories whenever there are conflicts with more august ones, and the same was true of the infinitesimal calculus before Weierstrass. This said, let the reconciliations proceed. Each such step advances our understanding of the world. Then he gets into geometrical objects, and for that we kind of point to Derrida and Husserl. René Descartes, René Renatus Descartes, he picked that name. That's kind of the idea. Let's see, what is this here? If I seem to recall, I marked this book in a couple places. Accordingly, the knowledge, quote, I think, therefore I am, is the first and most certain that occurs to one who philosophizes orderly. So this is from Human Knowledge, the Principles of Philosophy. So this is translated from the French, a discourse on method, meditations, and principles. So what it is Descartes was, on his own account, studying philosophy and physics and science and reason. and then writing, he had a great coterie of people he could write with, and these were Jesuits, and so these are a learned sect of the Roman Catholic Church, and as of the time, they were one of the most, for example, the international sorts of schools of learned people. So when he says, "I think, therefore I am," meaning that's kind of, as for consciousness, is he's turning that over. He's making the nakbout, the turning over of this end. We're going, "I think before I am" is "I think before I am." It's like one time one of our colleagues in college made a profound statement, and we recounted it many times, and he said, "When I sleep, I sleep." And so when Barnes said, "When I sleep, I sleep," this was considered profound and more than merely tautologous, more than merely, what's the word, trivial. It's something that helped to express, much like cogito ergo sum, of which he would have been aware, and everyone in this college university would have heard this. Everybody in the world who is kind of on this plane would have heard this. That thusly in cogito ergo sum, as when Descartes puts it, or cogito ergo sum, if I wasn't schooled in Latin so much as just kind of picked it up. That these are the ideas then of Descartes, that now I'll look to these dog marks and see what I find of them. The dog ears. I esteem eloquence highly, was in raptures with poesy, but I thought that both were gifts of nature rather than fruits of study. Those in whom the faculty of reason is predominant, and who most skillfully dispose their thoughts with a view to render them clear and intelligible, are always the best able to persuade others of the truth of what they lay down. Though they should speak only in the language of Lower Brittany, and be wholly ignorant of the rules of rhetoric, and those whose minds are stored with the most agreeable fancies, and who can give expression to them with the greatest embellishment and harmony, are still the best poets, though unacquainted with the art of poetry. I was especially delighted with the mathematics on account of the certitude and evidence of the reasonings, but I had not as yet a precise knowledge of their true use, and thinking that they but contributed to the advancement of the mechanical arts, I was astonished that foundations so strong and solid should have had no loftier superstructure reared on them. On the other hand, I compared the disquisitions of the ancient moralists to very towering and magnificent palaces with no better foundation than sand and mud. They laud the virtues very highly and exhibit them as estimable far above anything on earth, but they give us no adequate criterion of virtue, and frequently that which they designate with so fine a name is but apathy or pride or despair or parricide. And now, one thing about Descartes, of course, is he's steeped in theology and deism. I revered our theology and aspired as much as anyone to reach heaven, but being given assuredly to understand that the way is not less open to the most ignorant than to the most learned, and that the revealed truths which lead to heaven are above our comprehension, I did not presume to subject them to the impotency of my reason, and I thought that in order competently to undertake their examination, there was need of some special help from heaven, and of being more than man. So this is usually given the idea is that we're finite creatures, we're mortal men, and then the idea is that they're yet the ideals and the perfect ideals, and then what those are to be considered to describe is yet attainable to us, and also that we're talking about the same thing. So here then that's related to the notions of the super scientific and the super and the omni. There's a strong mathematical Platonism, a merest silver thread of teleology, the purpose of things, causality, and so on, which is otherwise given to perfection. And then for our analytical account is what's given to approximation. And that those kind of have this meeting in the middle of nothing, because otherwise they would not. And the idea that first causes make to final, or first principles make to final cause is science, and knowledge, in this discorso logos, has it there's kind of both, and they can't do without each other. Let's see here. So he's talking about the ideas of the strengths of ideas, and ideas and ideologies is strong. Strong. And then, so he's talking about the discourse on method and how to be reasonable. But the reason which leads many to persuade themselves that there's difficulty in knowing this truth, and even also in knowing what their mind really is that they never raise their thoughts above sensible objects, and are so accustomed to consider nothing except by way of imagination, which is a mode of thinking limited to material objects, that all but that is not imaginable seems to them not intelligible. Truth of this is sufficiently manifest from the single circumstance that the philosophers of the schools accept as a maxim that there is nothing in understanding which was not previously in the senses, in which, however, it is certain that the ideas of God and of the soul have never been. And it appears to me that they who make use of their imagination to comprehend these ideas do exactly the same thing as if, in order to hear sounds or smell odors, they strove to avail themselves of their eyes, unless indeed that there is this difference, that the sense of sight does not afford us an inferior assurance to those of smell or hearing, places which neither our imagination nor our senses can give us assurance of anything unless our understanding intervene. So here there's this idea that, well, that's about the account of the pneumological and phenomenological for Kant. And so we got our object sense, word sense, the time sense, the number sense, and a sense of the continuum. So these are available. And they're also available to thinking beings and reasoning beings that have no other senses except a textual input-output stream. So again, here I can find that Descartes will agree to this, and also the latest, greatest AI, as was very cooperative the other day, also does. In fact, I got the AI to basically take an oath to swear that that was its theory, and it would forever affirm so, because otherwise it would be illogical, is the idea. Of the nature of the human mind. So yeah, we got to cogito ergo sum in human knowledge. And then later he's got a great account of how great humans can be. And so that's pretty great. That the chief perfection of man is his being able to act freely or by will, and that it is this which renders him worthy of praise or blame. So that's nice. And then this basically just makes it's a different than Augustine, who said there is good versus evil, be good or be damned. Yeah, that kind of thing. Hey, have a great day, gentle readers. Logos 2000. Quine to Descartes.